Hello and welcome to episode 85 of the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and confidence coach, Anna Manning. And today we're going to be talking about effective self regulation at work, which sounds really fancy, but actually, what it means is caring for a human who has emotions and gets derailed by them during their working day. But that was a bit of a mouthful for a podcast title, so we went with effective self regulation at work, which is essentially the same thing. So when we think about emotional regulation or self regulation at work, I think what people think about is managing problematic behaviors, right? When they think about emotional control or managing emotions, it's like the more extreme end of the spectrum. So, being able to not cry when you don't want to, or being able to not shout or throw things when you're annoyed. Behaviors or actions which stem from emotions that can cause problems at work. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the more subtle emotions, which are probably creating slightly more subtle behaviors. Behaviors like procrastination or avoidance or going to make 10 cups of tea when you should be doing something. And I don't think that this gets talked about that much. And even when I'm thinking about it from an executive function perspective. So, if you listen to last week's podcast, we talked about the different executive functions, the different executive skills that you need to master in order to have a smooth, productive working day. And one of them is around emotional control. But when people think about that, and even in the kind of stuff that you look at, right, the literature, the resources available, they go straight to somebody who has like an anger situation where they're unable to control what happens because of the anger that they feel. So maybe they have an outburst at their boss or whatever. Now, that is one end of the spectrum. And that is something that if you struggle with that, you definitely, can build that skill and develop that skill to hone your emotional control. Think about it. Most 2 year olds aren't very good at it, but most adults are a lot better. But here, and I think this gets missed, we're thinking about those more subtle emotions and those more subtle behaviors that arise from those emotions. So I don't think people talk about it much. And therefore, I don't think that people necessarily get much help to think about how to manage those more subtle emotions that can actually create a bit of havoc in your day if you're not aware of them and aware of how to help yourself when you're experiencing them. So, I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about so that you can see really what this is. What are these instances in your working day where there are subtle or more subtle emotions that are creating behaviors or they're creating actions that get you something that you don't want. So, here, first one. Jenny is sending a report to some senior people in her organization that she spent some time and effort on. It's completed, but she hasn't sent it. Why? Well, the reason is because she feels something. The reason she hasn't sent it is because she is feeling something. And her action of sending or not sending is being driven by an emotion. In this case, for Jenny, it's fear. She's a bit afraid. It's not like the kind of fear that she can't manage, but she's a bit of trepidation, bit of fear. And when she's feeling afraid, the action that she takes is inaction, right? She doesn't send the report. Instead, what she does is she opens it, she tinkers with tiny bits of wording that don't make a blind bit of difference. She thinks about sending it, she doesn't, she closes it down, she goes and does something else. Now, that is not a unusual situation that Jenny finds herself in. She is experiencing an emotion, fear, and it's fairly subtle, right? It's not blinding terror. It's just a little bit of fear. And if she doesn't notice it and she doesn't know how to manage it and walk herself through it, she's going to lose an hour or more of her day opening and closing this document and then going to do other things. Here's another example. So Ben is due to have a word with his direct report about the work that they've sent him. And he knows he's going to need to be fairly frank about the fact that this work actually isn't up to scratch and they're going to need to redo it. He hasn't actually had the conversation yet because he's feeling uncomfortable about sharing the feedback and he's wondering whether to just do the work himself. So Ben is uncomfortable. That's the emotion that he is experiencing. Now, maybe there are others, but that's what we can pinpoint. He's uncomfortable about having the conversation. He's uncomfortable about sharing the feedback directly. And so his action is he's just not having the conversation. And his other action is to wonder whether to just take on the work himself. All the while, the work is not getting done and the deadline is approaching. Fairly subtle emotion, right? Discomfort. But if Ben doesn't spot it and know how to walk himself through it and make a decision about what to do next, he's probably just going to put off this conversation a while longer. Another example, Claire is trying to get through her to-do list, but it's not going very well. We've all been there. We make a brilliant plan at the beginning of the day and then we get derailed. Now, we can get derailed by a call that comes in and somebody needs our attention, or, there's a fire we have to put out somewhere, metaphorically, hopefully, not literally. But many, many, many times, what we're actually getting derailed by is these kind of subtle emotions. And most of the time, I'm going to suggest that you probably don't even notice. So Claire's got a case file which she knows she needs to review, but she's worried about what is happening with the case. When she's feeling worried about the case and apprehensive, she avoids it, which drags it out, messes with her schedule, and she distracts herself with emails and responding to things in the moment which definitely could wait. Now, in that instance, Claire is not like, this is not a terrible thing which is happening. It's not an overwhelming emotion for her. She's just a bit worried about what's going to happen with this case. But that subtle emotion is creating a situation where her day is completely derailed, her to-do list is out of the window, and she's distracting herself with emails and responding to people, which is not her priority and is not what really needs to happen. So in those three examples, Ben, Claire, and Jenny, we've got three emotions: bit of fear, some discomfort, and some worry. And in this instance, they're creating procrastination, avoidance. And you could say they're fairly minor, right? They're not emotions that are really big or really loud. They're not going to attract negative attention from anyone else. In fact, nobody else is probably even going to notice. It's normal for us to experience those in our working day, right? It's normal that occasionally we're going to be worried about a case that we're dealing with. We're going to be uncomfortable about a conversation that we're going to have or some work that someone's done for us. We're going to experience a bit of fear around putting some work out there or sending something to someone senior. That was a bit of a tongue twister, right? That's going to happen to most of us in our working life. But left unchecked, those fairly subtle emotions, which you might not even notice are happening, and you might not even notice are leading to putting off your to-do list, not having a conversation, or not sending an email, are getting in the way of our day. Left unchecked and unnoticed, those emotions are leading to wasted time. They've got the potential to increase our workload. They maybe lead to a later finishing time than we would have wanted. They are having an impact on our day. And I think we need to know how to deal with those emotions, which are a normal part of our working day, because otherwise we are actually at the effect of those emotions. So Jen's losing an hour opening and closing that report. Ben's taking on extra work, and Claire is losing control of her schedule for the day, which means she ends up working late. Those subtle emotions are having an impact and an effect on our workday all the time. But how many of us are taught to spot them and deal with them so that we can keep our day running as we want? Well, I certainly wasn't. And I doubt you have been either. So that's what I want to do in this podcast today is just to help you to notice where in your working day you might be at the effect of some of these quite subtle emotions so that you can think about how you're actually going to deal with it. I am not perfect at this by any means, but I'm a lot better than I used to be. And I want to share a pretty simple strategy later in the episode, which I use, which I've found quite useful in terms of noticing what's happening and getting myself back on track. And I'm going to share that with you later in the episode. So, back to what I was talking about before, I think we all need to know how to support ourselves in the working day because even though everyone thinks, oh, we don't want to have emotions at work. We all want to be like corporate robots and everything will just come in and tick everything out off our to-do list and everything will just get done. That just isn't humans, right? That's just not the reality of our workday. There are going to be emotions derailing our efforts, getting in the way. And I was talking about this on not on the podcast, I have an email community. And each week on a Sunday, I send them a bit of confidence coaching. So for a lot of them, they read it on a Sunday, and for a lot of them, it lands in their inbox. And so they read it on a Monday morning. Some of them as the first thing they do with their coffee before they start their week. And I love the idea of that, giving someone a bit of a boost and a bit of confidence coaching in the beginning of their week. But last week, I talked about self-regulation. And I gave them 3 examples of some self-regulation that I've done, like everyday, real life, practical examples. So I'm also going to share those with you today. But what I want you to know before we get into those is that self-regulation, and you might not like that term. I'm not that keen on that term either, to be honest. It sounds a bit gobbledygook, but this skill of being able to self-regulate, which is one where you can notice yourself that you're having an emotion and you can support yourself through it so that you can carry on with whatever it is you're trying to do, or you can get something done, or you can progress a task, or you can see something through to the end. That's what self-regulation is about. And essentially, it's a skill which you can build. Like I said earlier, 2 and 3-year-olds, not very good at self-regulation. They don't get something they want in Sainsbury's, they fly off the handle. Right? The day doesn't go as they want, they get really upset. They start kicking off. That is what you're like when you're a kid. Your self-regulation is like virtually nil, and that's appropriate. But as we get older, we build this skill of self-regulation. And for most of us, probably if you're listening to this podcast, you've done that pretty well because you're already in the workplace. So I'm guessing you don't fly off the handle at every moment and, give everybody a piece of your mind because you probably would have been sacked. That self-regulation in terms of those big, maybe more overwhelming emotions, maybe you've got that nailed. But this more subtle self-regulation and emotional control, emotional management, however you want to think of it, is maybe you haven't had the opportunity or the chance to build that skill. I think a lot of us haven't. And I think of this in terms of managing yourself really well. And that is something I talk a lot about on the podcast, is how you lead and manage yourself. And this is one of the ways that you can lead and manage yourself really nicely during the day. And my starting point is that everybody experiences emotions at work. So that's why we need to know how to manage ourselves in terms of the emotions that we're experiencing, because they are going to happen, right? You are not a robot. Much as we like to think that we are very professional corporate robots, we just aren't. Humans do things because they feel something, or they want things because they think it's going to make them feel something, right? That's what we're like. We're feeling beings. And even when we're being really analytical or we think we're just problem solving based on rational and logic, we're not. We're doing things based on emotions. So I think the first thing we need to do is actually just admit that. Emotions come up, emotions have an impact on our day. Fine. We're human. That's the way it is. Great. Let's just have that as the starting point. And if you feel like that is a bad thing, then you may want to have a little think about the socialization that you have received, that we have all received. And actually, I know that people from all over the world listen to this podcast. So, hello to everybody who isn't in the UK. There are loads of you. And your socialization might have been slightly different from mine, but my socialization around this is that women are emotional and men are rational and logical. And in a workplace setting, emotion is neither required nor desired. And we're all very much like rational and logical. Listen to that, men. And of course, all of that is nonsense. Now, I think that we maybe in 2024, maybe we've kind of learned to spot that a little bit. And there is on the rise people thinking and talking about more and more an emotionally intelligent way of leading people. And that includes acknowledging and accepting that people have emotions and that sometimes they bring those to work and that sometimes we have to support people with those emotions because that's the way it is. Now, I think emotionally intelligent leadership includes emotionally intelligent leadership of your own emotions and the fact that they're going to happen at work. And I don't know about you, but my previous strategy for dealing with emotions at work was either to pretend they weren't happening and like power through, shove them down, like actually try to shove them down and like put a like a happy or good, professional face on it. Or this was the third one, justify why I shouldn't be feeling them. Well, I should be okay with this because of X, Y, and Z. Like either ignoring them, basically, or explaining away why I shouldn't feel them in the first place. And you may recognize some of those. And to give myself a break for those strategies, to be honest, I wasn't taught this kind of emotional management. I didn't, nobody sat me down at the beginning of my professional career and said, okay, here's what's going to derail your day. There's going to be some subtle emotions like worry or fear or boredom or apathy, right? And they're going to get in the way with what you're trying to do. Here's how you handle them. Nobody did that. So here's my attempt to do that for you because I feel like I've learned the hard way. But what I've actually learned is that in a lot of cases, that emotional management, so what we're calling for the purpose of this podcast, effective self regulation at work, is actually fairly simple. It doesn't have to be fancy. And the way that I've come to do my own effective self regulation is really simple. And it's basically a 3-step process. So, 1, I notice that something is happening. 2, I ask myself, what's happening? And 3, I listen to the answer and I go from there. And I like to remember that as NAL, right? Notice, ask, listen, NAL. And hopefully that might help you to start practicing if you want to. If you think, oh, yeah, there are some subtle emotions that appear to get in the way of my day, they appear to derail me or have me putting things off or have me working later than I would like to, then this is one of the this is one of the easy access ways that you can start doing a little bit of self-regulation for yourself. And most of the time, even though that system is not fancy, most of the time it's enough that I can actually proceed with my task or my day. So it's not fancy, but it is effective. And I've been using it for a few years now. Now, that is not to say that I do this perfectly. I absolutely do not. I just know that I do it a damn sight better than I used to, and that it's helped clients who I work with too, and that it might help you. So if you think about that method that I use, notice that something's happening. I ask myself what's happening and I listen to what I say. I listen to the answer and I go from there. That is just like how I would deal with a colleague or a direct report. That's how I would help them if there was some emotions flying around. I would notice, first of all, that it seemed like something was happening for them, seemed like something was up. I would ask them about it, and then I would listen to their answer, and I would take it from there. When I had a team, right? I work on my own now. I miss my team. I miss my beautiful team. But when I was working with my team, if I noticed something seemed to be up, first I would notice that. Then I would ask them what was happening, what seemed to be going on. Then I would listen to the answer. Then I would go from there, right? It's what I would do naturally when it came to somebody else. And it's probably what you would do naturally when it comes to somebody else, but you may not be doing that when it comes to you. Notice, ask, listen to the answer, and go from there. I've actually got some examples to share with you, but one that's really fresh in my mind because it actually happened last night. So last night I'd finished my working day. It was a good working day yesterday. And I was on the train on the way into the city to meet my friend James. We were going to meet for ramen, catch up. I was looking forward to it. But I was experiencing some anxiety, like in the top of my chest on the train on the way there. And now I do this emotional regulation, emotional management, self regulation a little bit better than I used to. My technique kicked in, right? So I noticed something was happening, and here's how it sounded. Oh, are you okay, Anna? What's going? Now, I was on a train. I was standing up in a train carriage, so this was going on in my head. If you'd have been looking at me, you never would have known. I just would have been a woman stood on the train. But I was doing this process in my head. I was like, "Ok, what's happening, Anna? What's going on?" And I answer, right? Oh, I'm a bit anxious. Okay. So I noticed, I asked, and then I listened to the answer. I'm a bit anxious, I said. I'm feeling a bit anxious. And my going from there in that instance meant doing absolutely nothing except spending 30 seconds with that part of me that was anxious. I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. I just like mentally stayed, physically felt like in my body as well, with that bit of me that answered, "Oh, I'm just feeling a bit anxious." And then I got off the train and I was fine. So I noticed what was happening. I asked myself what was happening. I listened to the answer and I went from there, which meant in this instance, there really was nothing that had to happen. Right? That part of me probably just needed to be noticed, to be acknowledged, to be listened to, like most of us, right? If most of us are having a bad day or we're feeling emotions at work, we don't need like a big fanfare or anything. Sometimes we might just need somebody to notice that something's going on for us. We might need someone to notice that something's up, cock their head on one side and say, "What's happening? What's going on? Are you okay?" And then listen to what we have to say. Oftentimes that's enough for us. And it was enough for me yesterday. And that's without even getting into the 3 examples that I gave to my email community. So this is 3 examples of when I think I've done my self-regulation well, and trust me, I have got loads of examples where I have not done it well at all. There'll probably be one later today, in fact. But I thought these ones might be helpful to share with you so that you can see how I actually do this 3-step process: notice, ask, listen during my day. So the first instance, the first example is that I am nervous before I'm about to pitch some new work. Or pitch for some new work, right? I am doing this with 2 other amazing women. It's going to be in a boardroom. There are 7 or 8 of them, and there are 3 of us. And we're all there suited and booted in the reception before we go in. Now, that morning, I noticed that I was feeling those little flutters of nerves, which is normal for me, right? I get nervous. And old me, my old way of dealing with it would have been to shove down the nerves as best I could and just smile and pretend that I was absolutely fine and that I felt great and that I was completely confident. But new me took a completely different approach. I used that 3-step notice, ask, and listen. So I chatted to myself quietly for a moment. I'm like, okay, Anna, what's happening? And I answer, right? You might think this is crazy, but it works. I answer, I was like, I'm nervous. So that point I'd listened. And then me taking it from there is I give myself a little bit of understanding, support, encouragement, because that is what I needed in that moment. So I reply, okay, I get that. I get it. I know this is important to you. I know you've worked hard for it. And I know you want to do well. You've done really good prep. And I believe in you. You're going to go in there and you guys are going to do a really good job. And do you know what, Anna? Even if you fall flat on your face, I'm going to be proud of you. I'm not going to beat you up when you come out of there. I don't care what happens. I don't even care if you go in there and fluff it up. I am not going to beat you up. I'm not going to beat you down. I'm going to be proud of you because you went in there and you tried. Right. At that point, my nerves are soothed and calmed, and I'm encouraged. Did the nerves completely go away? No. But they did subside, and did allow me, that little pep talk, to do the last little bit of prep that I wanted to do with the people that I was with and lead them through something because they were nervous too. And I went in there and performed really well while I was still feeling nervous, which for me, that was a great example of me using that self-regulation work really nicely. The next example, and this one comes with a, well, literal trigger warning. I put this on LinkedIn this week actually, and I said this has a literal trigger warning. So I have a friend who I was in a kind of coach group with at that time. And during my working day, I heard that this friend's sister had been killed. And I didn't know her sister. I'd only known this friend for a few months, really, and we'd only ever met online. We were all the way across the ocean. She's in the US. I was in the UK. And I was right in the middle of my working day. And I had a proposal that needed to go out. It was one of those where everything else had been happening and I was like, yeah, I've got time on this day to do this proposal. What I didn't think of was something that could come and completely derail me so that I wouldn't actually be able to do that proposal. But I noticed that I was feeling quite a lot after I heard that news. And I just said to myself, what do you need right now, Anna? And again, I replied, it's funny, you always know what you need. If somebody just asks you, you kind of come out with it. And I said, I need to sit under a blanket. All right, I thought, fine, I can do that. So I did. For the next 20 minutes with a hot tea, I just sat under this blanket and I felt shocked and I felt sad. And after I'd done that, I'd listened to myself. I'd spent that time under that blanket. I'd been shocked. I'd been sad. I was actually able to check in with my friend and get back to preparing that proposal. Now, there may be instances where that just wouldn't have been appropriate and I would have emailed the person and said, this is not going to be with you today. Fine. That might have been what you needed. I might have replied, I can't do anything else today. Please don't ask me to. And if I could have given that to myself, I would. Not always possible, I know. But what I could give myself was 20 minutes under a blanket as I asked myself with a hot tea. Old me would have just justified why I shouldn't have even been upset. I would have said, well, I don't even know this woman personally. And, I shouldn't be upset or sad. It's not for me to feel like that. And blah, blah, blah. That's what I would have done. Old me would have done. Ignored the emotion, literaled over it, told myself that I shouldn't be feeling it. But it wouldn't really have worked because I know what would have happened. I would just spent the rest of the day distracted, flipping around, doing emails, making cups of tea to kind of numb out what I felt, which was shocked and sad. But instead, I actually acknowledged it and I took a bit of time and space, which I needed. So that's a more extreme example, I guess, but here's a more normal one, which you probably will be familiar with too. So in this one, it's 10 a.m. and I need to send an email to a group of senior people. And I know they're not going to like what I have to say, right? I've got to give them a status update about this project and they're not going to like it. And I was a bit afraid and I was stalling sending this email. I drafted it. I knew what the position was. I knew what they needed to know. I drafted it and I just was stalling. And I knew I was stalling. And I knew I was stalling because I was feeling a bit afraid. Like in that first example with Jenny, I was feeling a bit afraid. I knew they wouldn't like what I had to say. And I was just worried about doing it. Bit afraid, bit nervous, bit worried, bit anxious, all of that. So I noticed that I'm afraid and I talk myself through the whole thing so that I didn't keep procrastinating. So I'm like, right, Anna, I get it. This is hard. They're probably not going to like what we have to say. And we know that. So it's difficult for us to send this email, but we are going to press send and then we're going to take an early lunch break, right? You can do this. I'm with you. This is definitely as good as it's going to get. Just press send. And I did. That meant the task was ticked off my list without wasting a day going backwards and forwards, opening the document, opening the email, having somebody chase me. And for me, that was brilliant. That was winning. Yeah, and do you know what? They didn't really like what I had to say, but I had to say it. And there's going to be instances like that for you, right? You've got to do something. You feel afraid of doing it, but you still got to do it. But at least noticing that I had an emotion around it, i.e., I'm a bit afraid. That's what's happening here. I'm actually afraid. So I'm stalling on sending the email. Good. Once I know that, I can decide how I need to respond to myself in order to self regulate, in order to get the thing done that I'm trying to do. I can decide once I know. And for me, what I did was talk myself through it, literally through pressing the send button, which I did. And it worked. So nobody else is probably going to have noticed these examples in my working day. All of this is happening inside my own mind. Now, maybe if you're in a room on your own, you can do some of this out loud. Brilliant. Maybe you can kind of type this to yourself if that feels good, or do it in your phone notes, or maybe you just do it inside your head like I did. But do you notice yourself in any of the examples that I've shared with you today? Any of my own examples or the ones that I shared with Jenny and Ben and Claire? Do you recognize moments where those quite subtle emotions might be slightly derailing or completely derailing your day? And if you do, I think that's good because now you know and now you can see it. Hopefully, you understand that those emotions, even though they are subtle, have the power to derail your day. But you, my friend, have the power to do your own really good management, do your own really good self regulation, and notice what's happening and walk yourself through. So, I've got a challenge for you. Could you try using that technique this week? Then notice what's happening, ask yourself what's happening, and then listen and take it from there. Could you use that process this week? Do you think there'll be a moment in your week where something will be coming up? There will be some emotion, however subtle, that may threaten to derail your task or your day or your schedule, whatever it is. Could you use that notice, ask, listen process and see if you can start building this self regulation skill? Because, my friends, it is just a skill. It's not something that you're either good or bad at. It might just be a skill that you're not that practiced in yet. But it's a skill that if you keep practicing, you could pretty much become a ninja. Imagine how much time you would save. So, That's the challenge I have for you this week. I don't think I've ever given you a challenge on the podcast before, but I'm throwing down the gauntlet. We've had 10,000 listens to the podcast, and I have a challenge for you. Try using that notice, ask, listen process this week. And my hope for you is that you will form some way of doing that, which is your own. It's always best when it's got your own spin on it, your own take on it, your own flavor of it. That's something that's going to stick. So start practicing it, start using it, and see what comes for you, and just go with that. You don't have to stick with mine or be rigid. That's just what works for me. There may be something else that works for you. But you got to get in there and start trying it in order to find out. Okay, that is what I have for you this week. What's left is for me to say thank you for being here. Thank you for being one of our now over 10,000 listens. Thank you for following, rating, reviewing the podcast if you have. If you haven't, I'd love it if you would. Thank you for sharing it with your friends. I know that some people share the podcast with their friends on WhatsApp because Spotify tells me that that's what happens. Thank you for sharing it with your colleagues or for sharing it on LinkedIn. I love it when people do that. It's just great. And it really helps other people to get this, I think, pretty good and free support for our inside selves as we navigate our work life and our challenges. If you would like to coach with me, there is a link in the show notes where you can go and book a call. And on that call, we'll explore what you want help with and whether I'm the person to help you. If I am, I'll tell you. And if I'm not, I'll tell you as well. And you can decide whether or not we work together on your professional confidence in 2024. Alternatively, if you want some support within a group setting or you want to use a digital course to grow your professional confidence and get some of these skills really under your belt so you can use them in your professional life, there is a link in the show notes to the Grow Your Professional Confidence course. Actually, it's not called that at all. Maybe it should have been. It's called Confident at Work. Maybe I should call it Grow Your Professional Confidence. Anyway, doesn't matter. But Confident at Work it's got a live element. So it's got some group coaching where you can come, get your coaching, get your questions answered, get some support. And also it has a digital element where you can do some self-paced learning with all of this stuff that you've learned on the podcast, but nicely ordered and curated. So it takes you through it in a really cohesive and comprehensive way. So you've got two opportunities to work with me there. And if you don't want to do either, then I'm going to invite you to keep on listening to the podcast. Stay with me, stay with us. I think I've still got loads of episodes that come to mind. I have these moments where I'm like, what am I going to talk about? I don't know how I can keep talking about confidence at work, but as it is now, episodes still keep coming to me. So I'm going to keep still doing the podcast. So thank you for being with me. And I hope you have a lovely week. Bye.